Um, it is performed by autotrophs and heterotrophs. By autotrophs, which are organisms that produce their own food, unlike heterotrophs, as they are the consumers, as autotrophs are the producers. As you can see in this picture, there's a variety of examples. As autotrophs are organisms like plants, algae, and some bacteria that make their own food, as they use photosynthesis to create energy-rich organic compounds from inorganic sources like carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. As on the other hand, the consumers, known as heterotrophs, they are organisms like animals, fungi, and many bacteria that cannot perform this process of photosynthesis. They rely on consuming other organisms to get energy and like the essential carbon they need to survive. Moving on to the role of chloroplasts in photosynthesis organisms. As we can see, here's a chloroplast right here, this green stem right there, as are vital organelles in photosynthetic organisms, primarily performing photosynthesis to convert light energy, water, and carbon dioxide into glucose, known as their food and oxygen. Their primary roles are, like I said before, photosynthesis, as they capture sunlight using pigments like chlorophyll to cover and power that conversion of carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. Now talking about the light independent reactions, they occur in the thylakoid membrane using light energy to produce ATP and NADPH, and light independent reactions as the Calvin cycle, we'll get to that later, occur in the stroma, where ATP and NADPH are used to fix CO2 into carbohydrates. Now moving on to the actual key structures of photosynthesis. They include the stroma, chloroplasts, stromata, the grana, thylakoids, and chlorophyll. As the stromata, I'll show you guys a picture first and then I'll explain it. So here's the picture. Stromata, as there are the pores on the surface of plants, leaves, and stems, and other organs, as each structured by two guard cells that regulate opening and closing, and their function is allowing for gas exchange like CO2 and O2. As we can see here, stromata, here are the other ones up there. As chloroplasts, they take those organelles within the plant cell where photosynthesis takes place, where their structure is like a double membrane enclosing internal structure, as its function is they are sites for converting light into chemical energy. Now moving on into thylakoids. Like I said here as well, there are flat sacs and chloroplasts which react to light and photosynthesis, as their function is to contain chlorophyll on our inside, the site of the light dependent reactions of photosynthesis. Now grana, like I showed you in the picture before, there are stacks of thylakoids within the chloroplast right here, as their structure consists of the discs resembling the stacks of coins, like those three, as we can see here, 3 stacks, as they increase the surface area for light absorption. Now the stroma is a gel-like fluid filling that space inside chloroplast surrounding the grana, as their function is they are the site of the light independent reactions known as the Calvin cycle, which we will get into later. And last but not least, chlorophyll. It is the primary pigment used by plants to capture light energy. Their function is to absorb light energy, particularly in the blue and red parts of the spectrum, giving plants their green color that we all know. Moving on to the importance of light energy and pigment absorption. Light energy they're crucial for photosynthesis because it provides the energy needed to convert light energy into the chemical energy, as those pigments like I believe chlorophyll, right? Yeah, they're essential for this process because they absorb the specific wavelengths of light, as we can see down here. Ignore this one down here. As they also capture the energy, initiating a chain of events that ultimately produces ATP and NADPH, which that process of ATP processes fuel growth for plants and is the foundation for most food webs on Earth. Now, moving on to the actual, I believe, the synthesis equation. The synthesis equation is carbon dioxide plus water, also known as energy from light, which turns into glucose, plus oxygen, known as we can see here, is 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O, water, and then 6 carbons, 6 hydrogen, 6 oxygen, plus 6 O2, which is oxygen. As the purpose of this equation of photosynthesis is for plants and other organisms to create their own food and release oxygen as a byproduct. And as it says down here, when that equation is read the opposite way, it is known as cellular respiration. As cellular respiration and photosynthesis are quite opposites. Now moving on to the 2 stages of photosynthesis. The first one is light reactions, as they occur in thylakoid membranes and involve chlorophyll. And then the second, or the light independent reactions, they use sunlight and water to create energy carriers like ATP and NADPH, while light independent reactions use energy and carbon dioxide to produce glucose, as known as the Calvin cycle. As we can see here, here's a picture of the Calvin cycle, as we learned about in class. As essentially the Calvin cycle consists of 5 carbons and 2 phosphates, and during this process it's called the carbon fixation, as they go in a process of Rubisco. And then during that process, CO2 comes into the equation and then fills out that Rubisco, known as the active site. And when that active site is essentially filled, sealed, they split directly in half. And when they split directly in half, it splits into 3 carbons and 1 phosphate. And then once they split down here, it is known as a 3PG, as a 3-phosphoglycerate. Once one of those 3PGs come down here, then ATP comes into the equation and gives it a phosphate. And then NADPH has electrons, so then those electrons attach from the ATP, known as NADP plus. And then all the phosphate really does is once it comes in, it draws electrons, and then that phosphate gets released again. So then once it only has electrons in the 3PG, it is known as an intermediate molecule, which then goes in the third process of regeneration of RUBP, where that same compound here of 3 carbons, 1 phosphate, 2 electrons, it is known as a glyceride 3-phosphate in this process, as all it really needs is 3 CO2s to result into 6 G3Ps, as this is the main product in the Calvin cycle to make sugar. And all we really need is 1 G3P to make sugar, as in once we get that 1 down here, these other 5 are then recycled back up here, which then once again turns into 5 carbon and 2 phosphates, and then repeats that cycle over and over and over again. And then last but not least, the electron transport chain. Its main job in photosynthesis is to use light energy and to generate ATP and NADPH, as this process takes place in the thylakoid membrane, inside the chloroplast. As when light excites electrons, those electrons travel through a series of proteins, and as they move, energy is released, pumped into hydrogen ions, and creating a gradient that powers ATP synthesis. Now the role of photosystem 1 and 2, and you can see these images right here. Photosystem 2, or PS2, is the first complex in the chain. It absorbs light energy, which excites electrons taken from water molecules, as this process splits water, releasing oxygen as a gas byproduct, which then those electrons reach photosystem 1, from those electrons sending out from a transport chain. PS1 absorbs more light energy to re-energize these electrons, which are then used to reduce NADP plus into NADPH, a highly energized molecule that carries electrons to the Calvin cycle. Now, looking at the flow of electrons, right? Yeah, and hydrogen ion gradient across the thylakoid membrane. Here it is at the top right here. Electrons flow from water through photosystem 2 down to the ETC to photosystem 1 and finally to NADP+. Meanwhile, hydrogen ions are actively pumped into the thylakoid space, increasing the proton concentration inside. This creates electrochemical gradients, meaning there is more H+ ions inside the thylakoid than outside in the stroma. Finally, this brings us to ATP synthase, as it is an enzyme embedded in the thylakoid membrane that works like a molecular turbine. As hydrogen ions flow back out of the thylakoid lumen through ATP synthase, the enzyme spins and uses that energy to convert ADP into inorganic phosphate into ATP. This process is also called chemiosmosis. In summary, photosystem 2 captures light and splits water, and then those electrons move through the ETC, creating a proton gradient. Together, these steps transform light energy into chemical energy stored in ATP and NADPH, which then powers those sugars into the Calvin cycle. Thank you.